Okay, we're going to pick this up where actually we're going to pick it up where we weren't last time. we already gone, we've already gone past this point, but there are some things I wanted to clarify. Um, Darwin felt that we needed to adapt. That was the essence of humanity. That's one of the reasons why we have expanded all over the world and taken over so much stuff is because we're such adaptive creatures. And adaptation is one of the hallmarks of being human. And theoretically, that's how we've survived. We've survived drought and we've survived ice ages and whatnot. And one of the ways we do that is by mutating, and some of our mutations have been positive. Most of our mutations have been positive. The other thing you need to know about adaptation is they're not always positive, they could be negative. Um, a good example, I don't know if this is a good example, but an example would be the way to survive in a hostile environment is to kill people. That's probably not especially positive, but if you were a mass murderer, this would be a way to survive. Another would be in today's strange climate, political climate. One of the ways to survive is to believe some of these conspiracy theories. And of course, that's not all that positive. I don't see it as being all that positive anyway. Um, and so that's adaptation to a situation. Do I become more liberal? Do I become more conservative? Do I start believing conspiracy theories? Um, that is adaptive, but at the same time, it may not be a positive adaptation. Psychologists today have adapted Darwin's theories into a field known as evolutionary psychology or sociobiology. Um, they see genetics as the prime driving force in social behavior. They do not discount the interaction between heredity and the environment. And a good example of adapting to your environment as the environment becomes more complex, the individual needs to become smarter in order to survive. And of course, that's one of the ways that humans evolved to be the way that they are. Um, we were very ape-like when we had a brain that was 440 cc's. Cc stands for cubic centimeter. Then we needed to adapt. We needed to change the way that we were, and we did. We added more brain mass, 1,000 cc's, and this is us today at 1,300 cc's, and we are the brilliant creatures that we are. I talked about Neanderthals last time. This is what a Neanderthal skull looks like. These two right here. As you can see, their teeth were different. Their faces were not quite as flat as ours. They had a brow ridge, and they also had an elongated head. And inside that head was a much larger brain. Well, it wasn't that much larger, I guess. A larger brain than we have as modern humans. It's kind of an interesting picture. Shows the size of a fetus's skull, size of a newborn skull, and the size of an adult skull, as you can see. So our heads are continually expanding as we age until we go through puberty and no more growth takes place after that. Neanderthals had a bigger brain than we do, and as you can see, it is obviously larger. The ultimate goal of all individual behavior and developmental change is survival and of their genetic material. Now, when we talk about the survival of genetic material, we are not only talking about the survival of the individual, but we're also talking about reproduction. So reproduction, in the essence of survival, is being able to pass on your genes to someone else. So reproduction becomes extremely important, and we're going to talk about this in just a second. But we can look at all kinds of other needs that we have, but the reality is that reproduction is at the is at the pinnacle. It is the one thing that we need to do in order to survive. All organisms adapt their behavior to ensure the survival of the basic elements of life. And here we go. Sociobiologists look at different aspects of social behavior to determine if it is adaptive. Altruism is where you sacrifice yourself for somebody else. Competition, where does competition come in? Socialization, being able to get along with people. Mating behavior and I'm going to talk about this in a second, and communication. Now, the reality is that everything has to do with mating behavior. If you're altruistic, you sacrifice yourself for somebody else. You may be sacrificing yourself for your offspring. You may be sacrificing yourself for your mate. And that's where altruism comes from. Competition has to do with selecting a mate. Um, Males compete with other males, females compete with other females for reproductive rights with a select individual. If you can imagine all the strange television shows and movies that we've seen where young ladies decide that they want that guy, and so they steal him from somebody else. Competition. And of course, males are always fighting each other for reproductive rights. Socialization has to do with being able to survive in a social situation so that you will be able to raise your offspring in a fairly positive environment. If you're not socialized, if there's no socialization taking place, then reproduction isn't going to take place. And of course, we talk about mating behavior, and of course, communication. What do women say they like in a man? Usually, it has something to do with his humor and his intelligence. Humor and intelligence. Now, humor and intelligence, of course. How in the world does he communicate that with someone? And the answer is through communication. He has to be able to communicate with them in order to inform them that they are someone that he is interested in. So everything, despite everything else, I mean, we can talk about all kinds of different factors that play into it, but the reality is that we are talking about the survival of our genes, and the only way that our genes can survive is through mating. So all of this other stuff is secondary to the mating behavior. Is primary. Now that may be my opinion. Society looks at different things. We don't want to talk about sex anymore, but the reality is that genetics are extremely important. And all of this has to do with who's going to get to make a baby with that lady right there. Ethology is the study of how innate behavior and hereditary factors influence developmental changes. One example would be Noam Chomsky's language acquisition device, a genetic predisposition to learn language to facilitate social interaction. And this, of course, is Noam Chomsky here, and our ability to communicate and our ability to learn language, to learn our own individual language is really important. Another example of ethology would be Konrad Lorenz's work showing that inducing the mothering instinct in a species leads to survivability of the offspring. I think I told you last time about I had a friend, or actually it was a student, who was making money hand over fist because he was able to breed a strong mothering instinct into the cattle that he was raising. And that was really important because the farmers were losing 20-30% of their calves because the mothers were doing a really poor job. They were walking off from their calves, and then their calves would be isolated. They'd be attacked by coyotes and killed. They'd freeze to death. They wouldn't be able to find their mothers, and they'd starve to death. But he was able to breed into them a strong mothering instinct. and because of that, his heifers were sought after because they, if you introduce this gene into a herd of cattle, eventually it's going to spread. It's going to spread to some degree. It's going to be stronger in some individuals and weak in other individuals, but it's going to be a genetic aspect that is accepted into the herd, whereas the herd was losing 20 to 30% before. Now suddenly the because of the genes being introduced into that herd, the loss of calf can be reduced by 10 or 15%, and that's what happened. So this is Konrad Lorenz. He's really kind of interesting. This is a film about him. It's not very long. Don't worry. Okay, there you go. Konrad Lorenz. Oops. An example of Lorenz's work is research that has found that when women are shown pictures of a baby that have greater pupillary dilation than men do, Eckhard Hess in 1962 concluded that women may have a greater biological predisposition to respond to babies. And of course, hopefully that's true. We have the idea that all women are natural mothers, but of course that's proven to be not true. Some women will reject their own children so that they can maintain a relationship with a male. They will allow the male to abuse their children, uh, whether it's the father of the children or not. I'm just using this as an example. We're not talking about 100% of women have this need or this desire to be good mothers. And here, no, this isn't where we started. Okay, psychodynamic theory. Both of these individuals represent the psychodynamic theory. The first developmental theory was the psychodynamic theory. Psychodynamic theories view the individual as solitary against the rest of the world. The first psychodynamic theory was Freud's psychosexual theory that purported that man developed due to sexual drives. Psychosexual developmental theory. Erikson, of course, refuted Freud and said that humans were driven by social needs. Psychosocial developmental theory. I explained to you last time why society was so important to Erikson, but I didn't really explain to you where Freud's theories came from. So let me reiterate what was going on with Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was he was the second. He was a member of the second family of his father. His father was in his 50s. He lost his wife. He had already raised a family of five. If I'm not mistaken, there were five in the first family. And then he married a 16-year-old girl. Now he's in his 50s, and this girl is in her is in her teens. And of course, he marries her for whatever reason, of course, and starts reproducing with her. And the first offspring is Sigmund Freud. So now you have to understand that he's already raised one family. This is also in the middle of the 19th century, so he's not really that interested in making his 16-year-old bride happy. So he ignores her a great deal. And because of this, of course, she looks to someone else for affection, and she finds it in her family, in her offspring, in her children. And of course, Sigmund is the oldest. He's a male, so she treats him as a special child. She has five other children. Two of them are males, and the rest are females, I believe. It was a 3-and-3 family. Anyway, so yeah, this it's not like this. The father wasn't having sex with his wife. He was having sex with her, of course, but he was not giving her the affection that a 16-year-old feels like they need. So as Freud was growing up, he was treated as a special child. He got all the affection from his mother. He was given special food, and that's maybe one of the reasons why he felt that he was intellectually superior to everybody, to a lot of other individuals. A form of narcissistic, I would say it's a personality disorder in his case, but that may be one of the reasons why he developed the psychosexual theory, because and like all people that are treated special, they don't really see it. They think it's the way that everybody's being treated, but the reality was, of course, he was being treated with a lot more affection than his brothers and sisters were. Um, he realized that this was very important to him. One night he had a dream, and the dream was that his mother had died, and I guess she had already died by this point. And he was a pallbearer, but he wasn't just a pallbearer. He was it was like in ancient Egypt, where they wore masks, and the mask that he wore was the mask of a bird. And from this, he determined that he was sexually attracted to his mother, that he was drawn to his mother. And that's where he came up with the psychosexual theory. And if you read the whole thing, it's really kind of interesting. So he realized that he had all these needs that were fulfilled at certain points during his life. And that's where he came up with his theory. And we're going to talk about it. We talked about it last time. I talked about Erickson last time, arguing with Freud. He's saying, no, 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 it's not. Sex doesn't have anything to do with sex. It has to do with society. And of course, Erickson was a blonde-headed, blue-eyed Jewish person, something that you never saw, or something that nobody ever saw. And so he was rejected by his Jewish community, by the Jewish community that he grew up in, because he looked German. And he was rejected by the German community, of course, because he was actually Jewish. So he was kind of in social no man's land, and he grew up that way, and he lived that way for the early part of his life. And then, of course, he looked for his father and couldn't find him. Um, After his mother told him that not only was he not the offspring, not the child of the person she was married to, but he was also he she had been married to somebody else, and but he wasn't the child of that person either. I guess it made his mother look like kind of a lady that plays around. Anyway, yeah, so he wandered off and eventually came to the States, and of course, at that point, he wrote his psychosocial theory, looking at all these social crises that he saw very distinctly, and the reason he saw them so distinctly was because he had no social support whatsoever. He was being rejected by everybody except his mother. And he wanted to be accepted by everyone, and that's one of the reasons why he took off and looked for his father. Anyway, so he came up with the psychosocial theory because that was the trauma of his life was the fact he was rejected by society, and of course Freud was sexually attracted to his mother, realized it, and sexual repression was the main cause of what was going on. Most of the mental illness in the 19th century had to do with sexual repression. He came up with the psychosexual theory. Okay, so now we're going to talk about stages, and these are things that have to take place in order for the person to develop normally. So the first stage of the psychosexual theory is you've got to survive. You've got to survive to reproduce. That's the whole point of sex, of the concept of sexuality. The very first thing that happens with the child is the oral stage. They get a fixation on their mouth. And the reason the fixation is on their mouth is because they need to eat. And the only way that they can eat is with their mouth. So if this doesn't happen, if they don't start suckling their mother, they're on their mother's breast, they will die. If they don't start eating in one form or another, then they will die. Well, of course, now we have the ability to feed these babies without them suckling something or drinking from a bottle or drinking from their mother's breasts. But in the old days, of course, in the 19th century, that wasn't possible. And so, of course, if the baby wouldn't drink, then the baby would be suffering from failure to thrive, and if the baby would starve to death. This had to take place in order for the baby to survive. So, but in a social situation, the very first crisis is whether they trust that their parents are going to be there or they mistrust their parents. Has to be resolved at birth, and it's the first 2 years of life. People talk about the terrible twos. This trust versus mistrust is taking place for the first 2 years. Now, the terrible twos have to do with something else. The second stage of the psychosexual theory is, of course, the anal stage before years 1 and 3, between the years of 1 and 3, when the child focuses on potty training to become a responsible member of society. And of course, initially it is their mouth, now it is their anus. They need to be aware of when they need to defecate. If they don't, then they will not be able to be a functioning member of society. You can't poop your pants and be an acceptable person in society. So this is the crisis that has to take place, and eventually, of course, this turns into a sexual thing as well. The second crisis in the psychosocial theory is autonomy versus shame. Shame and doubt, I'm sorry, when the child must learn to become an independent person. And of course, that is what needs to take place. And this is one of the reasons why the terrible twos are the terrible twos, because before the child was totally dependent on the parent, and at about age 2, they start seeking autonomy. And this has to take place for them to develop normally. So they have to potty train, they have to develop autonomy in order to develop normally, whether in both theories. The third stage, as far as Freud was concerned, was when you develop your your understanding of the fact that you're either a boy or you're either a male or a female, and this he called the phallic stage. Phallus, of course, has to do with the penis. I guess he could have called it the vaginal stage if he wanted to. But of course, it was a male-dominated society at that time, so he was looking primarily at males. Now, the interesting thing about Freud was that he had a practice, and most of the people in his practice, most of the clients that he saw, most of the patients that he saw were women, and it had to do with sexual repression. Their problems all tended to stem from sexual repression. And it was a really serious problem in this time. If you look at pictures of women from the 19th century, what we refer to as the Victorian age. They were very completely dressed. They showed no skin whatsoever. They wore a dress all the way down to their ankles. If a man saw a woman's ankles, he thought he saw something extreme. They always had everything covered from their down to their wrists, and then they wore gloves, and then they would wear dresses that came up and covered their necks. So not only were we not seeing any cleavage, but we also weren't seeing any wrists and any necks either. And if they were proper women, they would wear a veil over their faces. So this is the way women dressed during the 19th century when he came up with his psychosexual theory. The third crisis, as far as Erikson was concerned, due to his psychosocial theory, is initiative versus guilt. When the child learns to try new things, or he isn't allowed to. They aren't allowed to. I'm sorry, it's not. It doesn't have to be a he. They aren't allowed to do that, and so this is the third stage between age 3 and 6, when they either develop the ability to try new things, or they are repressed. They are kept from doing that. The fourth stage of Freud's psychosexual theory deals with a time of sexual complacency from age 6 until puberty, and he refers to this as the latency stage. They are a time bomb waiting to go off, and they will go off in adolescence. And if you have ever talked to a teacher, they'll talk about how their kids are just little angels when they're in the first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade. Starting in the fifth grade, things get a little squirrely. They start acting a little, they can't sit still. They have lots and lots of energy. Now, one of the interesting things about the latency stage, this is from age 6 until about age 9 or 10. The interesting about this stage is that if somebody is sexualized, if someone has been taught about sex by an adult or by an older brother or sister, then you can see it, and it's very obvious in this day and age. The last thing on their mind is sex, as weird as that is. But if it isn't the last thing on their mind, then you may have a sexual molestation situation, and it's something that needs to be addressed. That's a latency stage as far as psychosexual theory is concerned. The next crisis, as far as Erikson is concerned, is industry versus inferiority. They start competing with other children in school. They start talking about how the grades they got on this test or that test or another test. Industry versus inferiority. Will they become will they be able to compete with everybody else in society, or will they lag behind everyone else? And of course, once upon a time when I was in school, this was almost 70 years ago. This was 65 years ago. They used to separate us into groups. So I was in a school with about 80 students in the first grade, and they divided us into two classes. And one class we were the bluebirds and redbirds, and the other class were the yellowbirds. And the yellowbirds had an easier reading. They had their math wasn't as challenging as ours was. So the reading skills were different. The math skills were different. It's really kind of fascinating how they used to do it. They don't do that anymore, of course. They put everyone in the same class so that you're learning with everyone else. But they used to do that. Freud's last stage is the genital stage, when the individual emerges as a reproductive being. Erikson's adolescent crisis is identity versus identity confusion, when teenagers try to discover a comfortable persona for the rest of their lives. And of course, if you think back to your high school days, you can remember people wearing different clothes. All of a sudden, they comb their hair in a different way. They were trying to act in a specific way. They were trying on different personas. What they were trying to do. Do I want to be a druggie? Do I want to be cool? Everybody's seeking cool, whatever that is, and that's what happens during adolescence. This is when we try different things. Uh, do I wear makeup? Do I paint my fingernails black? Do I wear red lipstick? All kinds of interesting things. And of course, males are doing the same thing. They're do I dress cool? Do I let my hair grow? Do I grow a beard? All of these things. They're different personas, and the question is, who am I? And eventually, of course, they will develop a persona that they can adhere to. Sometimes they will change these personas. A lot of individuals don't know who they are, and it takes them an extended length of time. One of the problems with using drugs and using alcohol is that it tends to arrest people at whatever stage they're in, and if they're in a identity versus identity confusion, they can act like a high school kid for into their 30s and 40s. I remember uh, when I was teaching up in Montana, it was weird because they'd have house parties, and here you got all these, it's a house party for, junior high and high school girls, and there would be 30 and 40-year-old men scamming on these young ladies, and you're going, wow, haven't you grown out of that by this time? And the answer was no, they hadn't, because they had started drinking in high school, and their brains still thought that they were teenagers. As stupid, I guess it's not stupid, it's just the way the world works. Okay, so Freud's done. His people are reproducing, and that's what he wanted, or what he feels like everybody needs. But the psychosocial theory continues throughout the rest of the individual's life. Erikson's next crisis faces the question of marriage versus bachelorhood, intimacy versus isolation, as weird as that is. Okay, this is intimacy, of course, the lady kissing the man. And this is isolation or bachelorhood, these individuals with the weird haircuts and the weird shoes. I typed bachelorhood into the computer, and most of it you couldn't tell one thing or another, but I found a picture of these guys, and I thought, no kidding. Uh, no kidding, they'll never find anybody that wants to have anything to do with them. The middle adulthood crisis that Erikson feels that people go through is generativity versus stagnation. During this crisis, the individual has to decide whether to help and mentor the younger generation or maintain a selfish lifestyle. There you go. And of course, you're either one person or the other. You're either the person that tries to help or the person that is too selfish or too self-absorbed to do that. Erikson's crisis continues right up to the end of life. The last crisis an individual faces is integrity versus despair. Does one see one's life as satisfactory, or does one see one's life as a failure? Okay, I think this is where I stopped last time. I didn't really talk about the learning theories. The learning theories have to do with behavioral modification with conditioning. It does have a developmental component to it. Um, Both Skinner and Watson, who were the developers of the behaviorism movement, felt that we could control people by conditioning them to do what we wanted them to do. And of course, B.F. Skinner is the guy on top, and the bottom picture is John B. Watson. One of the pictures is, of course, him when he's younger, and and then the picture down below is when he's older. And he was kind of an interesting figure. Actually, both of these guys are a little goofy. Watson, and of course, you have to remember they are products of their time. They and they were looking for control. They were seeking control. They were both Americans. They were from the United States. Skinner's from the Northeast, and Watson was from the South. Control in the United States, we think about production and being able to get people to produce a lot of goods. And that's where behaviorism came from. And of course, there was this movement, the Victorian movement, where people didn't show affection in public. That was something that only the lower classes did. They showed affection in public. So that was the idea. Watson once wrote a book that stated you should pat your children on the head in the morning and shake their hands at night, but never show them more affection than that. I mean, that was the essence of Watson's ideas. Now, Watson was really kind of an interesting figure because he started working at Johns Hopkins University, and he was doing his research, and you could see his research. There are films of some of the things that he did, but Watson got himself in trouble. He was having sex with a colleague's wife. And of course, he was named as co-respondent in the divorce. And at that point, because he was named as a co-respondent in a divorce, he lost his job. He also lost his, of course, he showed that he had no integrity as far as psychology was concerned. So he quit the field. He was no longer a psychologist. And sadly, he went into advertising. And that may be one of the reasons why our advertising is so manipulative, because Watson is one of the individuals that started applying psychological theory to advertising. Skinner, on the other hand, picked up the torch at that point, and he came up with his own theories. These became behaviorism. Watson theorized that children could be conditioned into anything that you wanted, but Skinner actually proved that he was right. Skinner developed the Skinner box for use with animal subjects. That was eventually expanded into a human version, and this is an example of the human version. Let me get out of this just for a second so that I get my arrow back. Let me see if I can get my arrow back. Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay, yeah, this is his daughter. And this is a Skinner box. This is what, if you work in animal research, this is a Skinner box. This is a lever, and if he pushes that, if he pushes that, he gets food pellets. There it is. He gets food pellets, or whatever. And you can do a lot of different things with the Skinner box. Well, this is a Skinner box as well. And if she pulls that lever enough times, I don't know what happens. He raised his daughter this way, and she wasn't real happy about it. Of course, the Skinner box never really caught on, the human crib thing. Skinner's use of rewards and punishments were referred to as operant conditioning. So when we talk about behaviorism, we talk about classical conditioning, and we also talk about operant conditioning. And that's operant conditioning is how they train animals. They train them. If they want them to do something like shoot a basketball, they have a raccoon that they want to shoot a basketball. Every time he gets closer and closer to doing what they want, they reward him. So they're leading him along until he can put the ball in the basket. By rewarding him every time he does something that is close to what they want. And that's the way they train elephants, and that's the way they train all animals. Skinner felt that by reinforcing or rewarding a behavior, a controller could increase the likelihood of the behavior occurring again. And this is the essence of behaviorism. On the other hand, by punishing a behavior, the controller would make it less likely to occur again. And there you go. This is punishment, of course. This is reward. You're complimenting your child, and this is punishment. He has to write something. I will not do something. I can't read it. Anyway, whatever he can and can't do. I'll tell you what. Let's see if we can make that so big that we can actually read it. Let me get out my magnifying glass and see if I can read it. Nope. I will not do something. I will not substitute. Let's see. I can't read it. Anyway, he won't do something. He's being punished. Let me go ahead and make this small again. There we go. All right. Okay. Social learning theory was developed by Albert Bandura, and it was primarily this experiment. What he did, he took a bunch of children. They were like between 3 and 5. He put one group. He took the two groups, and the first group he allowed to play with the toys. And when they played with the toys, they just played with the toys any way that they wanted. The second group he put in a room so that they could see the toys, but so they couldn't play with the toys. And he brought an adult in, and the adult started being really mean to the toys. This shows the. It's really a fascinating film. Here's the adult hitting the Bozo the clown. I actually had one of these when I was a kid, hitting it with a wooden mallet, and something that the other group hadn't done. So it was really kind of interesting. After the adult left and they let the kids in the room, they started playing with the toys the same way the adult did. They had learned that behavior from watching the adult playing with the toys. And this shows a little girl, a little 2 or 3-year-old girl, beating on this clown with a wooden mallet, just like she saw the adult doing. And this is known as social learning theory. Bandura feels that people learn and copy people who are around them through imitation, which he referred to as observational learning. So all we have to do is see somebody do something and we do it too. Now this may have a lot to do with what happened at the Capitol on the 6th of January. All of those people may not have had the idea, I think we need to attack the police and try to get through and go into the Capitol and change what's happening. A lot of the people may have just been there to show support to President Trump. But once it started, they all seemed to think it was a good idea. And this may have been, much of this may have been observational learning. There was a lot of violence in that riot. Bandura feels that people construct themselves through rewards, punishments, and imitation, and then view the outcome as self-efficacy. In other words, if I do something that I like, I dress up like Elvis Presley, and I go out and people tell me how cool I look, that's a reward. And if I dress in another way and comb my hair in a different way, and people start ignoring me, that's punishment. So here I'm imitating. I get a reward for being like Elvis. I get punished by being ignored when I'm not dressed like Elvis. And so now I think that this is the way to be. And of course, the next picture is Elvis impersonators. So the question is, why in the world are they imitating Elvis? And the answer is because they think he is so cool. And of course, they are rewarded by what? By being women paying attention to them, I'm assuming. These are Elvi. They're in the building. Anyway, it's a picture of all these Elvis impersonators. I just found this really fascinating. Most of them are dressed in this same type of outfit. This is Elvis in the 50s, and this is Elvis in the 70s, is when they're in the white. And they all do kind of look like Elvis. And they, as you can see, they've all got their hair cut like Elvis Presley anyway. And that's why we do the things that we do. We have, and this is social learning theory. The cognitive development theory was developed by Jean Piaget from Switzerland. Piaget based his theory on the cognitive development of children. This is really kind of fascinating. I started in psychology in the 1970s. Piaget was writing his theories starting in the 1920s, 1930s. He was from Switzerland and he wrote his theories in French. And at the time, we weren't really that friendly with the French for some reason. We have had a love-hate relationship with the French for a long time. So a lot of people in the United States weren't able to read Piaget's writing. Then in the 1970s, somebody translated Piaget, and before Piaget, it was Erikson. But I started in psychology in the 1970s, and nobody had ever heard of Jean Piaget. It wasn't until the 80s and 90s that it was educational psych people were picking up on Piaget, and I'd never even heard the name before until the 1980s and 1990s. Now you can say he was out there. Sure, he was out there, but nobody in the United States was reading him. And the only people we were talking about at the time was Erikson. And I can remember when the switch happened between Erikson and Piaget. I was teaching at, this is in the 1990s. I was teaching at a college in Mississippi. And the psychology department was part of the education department. And there were advocates for Piaget and advocates for Erikson in the education department. The psychology department didn't care. We were talking about Freud, we were talking about Erikson, and we weren't really talking about Piaget yet. And of course, because of because the teacher educators wanted us to start talking about him, we had to suddenly read this guy. And of course, most of his writings were from the 60s and 70s and hadn't been translated until the 70s and 80s. So it was really kind of a fascinating to watch, education move from talking about Erikson to talking about Piaget. Anyway, now of course everybody's acting like they've been cognitive developmental theorists. Education has been cognitive developmental theorists ever since the beginning of time, but that's not really completely true if you've been in the game for as long as I have. Piaget based his theory on cognitive development of the child, which makes a lot of sense. And if we're talking about education, we're talking about the development of the brain. Piaget's first stage is the sensory motor stage and begins at birth and runs through age 2. Now you may notice that this is exactly the same as Erikson's psychosocial theory and Freud's psychosexual theory. It runs to age 2, the terrible twos. At the terrible twos, everything changes. In this stage, the infant and toddler's knowledge is based on their senses and their motor skills. Piaget's second stage, just like Freud and Erikson, it runs from toddlerhood until the beginning of elementary school, age 2 to 6, and involves a child's first attempts at reading and using numbers. Hopefully they do. They start thinking about these things because they need to already be introduced to them by the time they're in school. This stage is known as the preoperational thought stage. And now they're in school. This is the third stage. It runs from first grade through junior high school and involves the continued maturation of applying experiences to the logical operations of their knowledge base and is referred to as the concrete operational stage. And as if you notice, if you have been thinking about this, it's exactly the same as Freud's latency stage and Erikson's, what did he call it? It wasn't autonomy, it was had to do with work. I, I can't think of it off the top of my head. Anyway, it's the same as Erickson's third stage. Erickson's third stage and Freud's third stage, concrete operational stage. Whoops, I'm sorry. Okay. The last stage, as far as he was concerned, just like the last stage, as far as Freud was concerned, is the formal operational thought. It begins in early adolescence and runs through the rest of the individual's life. The stage involves the ability to think abstractly and to deal with hypothetical situations. And don't ask me why I put a picture of Harry Potter and all the other wizards and witches. Didn't they call them witches? Yeah, okay. Wizards and witches. So there you go. I found it fascinating while I was reading Harry Potter, but I'm kind of over it now. I've seen the movies too many times. Lev Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist who felt that the environment dictated what and how a child should be should be taught. Vygotsky was really kind of interesting. We didn't even know anything about Vygotsky until the 70s either. And the reason we didn't know anything about Vygotsky was because we were in the Cold War. Vygotsky, we got upset with the Russians after World War One. They were the Bolsheviks at that point, and then they became communists. We were kind of upset with them. We kind of ignored them for about 20 years until the World War II started, and Hitler attacked Russia, and they became our allies. They were our friends for 4 years. We were sending them materiel to fight the war. So they were okay for 4 years, and then all of a sudden, after the war, then the Cold War started. And so we haven't really cared about what was going on in Russia for about, or since the beginning or since the Bolsheviks took over in Russia after the Russian Revolution, after World War One. But now we do know Vygotsky, and people will say, "Hey, he makes a lot of sense," and this may make a lot of sense as far as you're concerned. Vygotsky's sociocultural theory saw that beliefs, customs, and skills of the culture being passed from adult to the young. This included formal education, and of course, this is the way they need to be taught. Using their customs, beliefs, and skills that fit their culture. Is Russia that much different than the United States? And the answer is not really that much different. But culture isn't very strong in the United States, or at least it's not very much recognized. You guys probably recognize the American culture better than I do because I lived in it and I don't even think about it. But since your culture is different than the American culture, you may see this as a really strong theory of learning. The ecological systems and systems approach, this is Urie Bronfenbrenner. He's from New York City, actually. Developed the ecological theory of development. This theory sees the child as the center of an ever-expanding system of influence that helps to create the person that the child will become. In the center of the concentric circle is the microsystem. We showed this is it right here. That's Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory. At the center is the child and his immediate family, not just his mother and father, but also his siblings, individuals that he has constant contact with. This is a microsystem. It's composed of the child, their parents, and their siblings. Especially in a family where the siblings have a lot of interaction with select children. Not all children, Freud would tell you that each child raises themselves and they're all individuals. But the reality is, of course, that in some families you've got brothers taking care of sisters, and in some families this is very common practice where and mom and dad don't have nearly as much to do with the child as the siblings do. And this, of course, is the microsystem. The next ring of influence in the concentric circle is the mesosystem. Meso, of course, means middle. This ring is closest to the child because the child has direct contact with it, his school, his friends, and extended family. Extended family, not siblings. This would be grandma. They come, grandma and grandpa that you see every other day, your aunts and uncles that you see every week, your cousin brothers and whatnot. That would be your extended family and your friends, of course, and the people you see at school. The next ring of influences in the concentric circle is the exosystem. Exo meaning outer. This ring influences the child, but they may not make contact with the child. Such things as parents' place of employment, the government and their social policies, and the parent's social network may or may not make contact with the child, but they still influence the child because they influence the parents. Parents have to work in order to make money. Uh, you may not have anything to do with wherever your parents work, but of course that whatever's happening at work influences your family. I have no idea why I have this chicken up here. I guess I have no idea. Anyway, this represents the government, of course. So the government does impact you, and of course, whoever is president impacts you. And there are a lot of, well, we won't go into any more politics, I guess. The outer ring of the system is the macro system. Macro meaning large. This circle influences the child, but is mostly abstract influences on the individual, such things as historical events, culture and ethnic group influence of the child, but is not something that the child has any influence over. In other words, you can't change it. You can't decide, well, I think Dene people need to start participating in powwows more. We need to show ourselves off to the rest of Indian country. That's not something you can't change your traditions. It just doesn't work that way. You have to either accept your traditions or reject them, I guess. This is my brother in Afghanistan. As you can see, he was there in 2005. That's my brother right there. And this is his Afghan driver. He was a lieutenant colonel. That's why he's got the sidearm. He was a lieutenant colonel. They were take a convoy of supplies to somebody, and they were on a mountain. Evidently, it looks pretty ugly to me. There's not a whole lot of green going on there. I'm going to show you another picture of him in just a minute. But of course, culture has a lot to do with it, and there's nothing you can do about historical events. Why was my brother in Afghanistan if he hadn't been in the army in 2005? He was actually in the reserves at this point, I think. Anyway, humanistic theories were developed from the work of Carl Rogers. Rogers saw the individual as a dynamic force that has the power to seek their own self-fulfillment by setting goals, meeting inner needs, and expressing creative energies. Carl Rogers, humanism was developed to combat the Freudian concept of unconscious drives controlling our behavior. It also argues that the environment does not dictate who the individual is going to be. And so Freud saw the individual as the culprit, and actually humanism sees society. If there's a problem with somebody, it's society's problem, not the individual's problem. It's the individual reacting to the environment. So the humanism sees the individual as almost a victim. Besides Rogers, one of the leading humanists was Abraham Maslow. Maslow recognized that people were motivated to seek their full potential, which he labeled self-actualization. Maslow arranged people's needs in a hierarchy that is normally arranged in a pyramidal structure. And here, the physiological needs are the ones that have to be met first. You don't eat, you don't drink water, you die. Next is safety and security. After you've fed yourself, now you need to worry about whether you're safe, whether you're in a secure situation. Once you feed yourself and are in a safe situation, Now you can worry about being belonging to a group. Uh, this never takes precedence over your physiological needs or your safety needs. Once this happens, then you may seek feelings of, of not fulfillment, of self-esteem, as you're okay, everything's okay. And then the last stage, of course, is self-actualization, where you can create things. So you'd never be a creative individual if you were starving to death. You'd never be a creative individual if you weren't living in a safe environment. You wouldn't be self-actualized, fulfilled, if you didn't feel like you belonged to something. And of course, you couldn't possibly feel self-actualized and creative if you didn't have any self-esteem. It was Maslow's idea that before people could achieve a higher level on the pyramid of needs, they had to take care of their lower needs first. Unless one's physiological needs are taken care of, safety is inconsequential. It is easy to observe Maslow's need structure in the plight of the refugees flooding into Europe from Africa and the Middle East. Physiological needs are the most important. Safety needs are not necessary until survival needs are taken care of. The personal needs are secondary to basic survival. Researchers have worked with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They see people changing their needs as they grow older. If you're thinking of going into social work is based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it's one of the things that you have to think about if you're going to go into social work. Infants and toddlers need their physiological needs taken care of course. As children get older, their safety needs are met. Adolescents are stuck in a time seeking self-esteem and belongingness. Only adults have fulfilled their lower needs and can seek self-actualization. One last theory is that of John Bowlby, as proven by Mary Ainsworth. Bowlby developed a theory that used an infant's attachment pattern to its parents as the basis for future human interaction. Ainsworth developed a test to determine the type of attachment the child displayed with their parents and came up with 4 major types of attachment: secure, avoidant, insecure, disorganized, disoriented, preoccupied, insecure. As we go through the Psych 240 book, the Human Growth and Development book, we will talk more about Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby. Just understand at this point that about 70 to 75% of children grow up in feeling secure. They have a secure attachment to their parents. One of the reasons is because if you remember Erikson, he talked about trust versus mistrust. And that's really what we're talking about. This individual feels that the child will, or the child feels that the parent will always be there if they need them, that their needs are being met. And this is what creates the secure attachment. The other attachments have to do with a lot of different things. And we'll talk about that when we come to it. My lifespan is multi-directional. The lifespan not only involves growth but decline as well as you get older. When I was a college student, I ran track and I could run let's see, what was my fastest time? I ran a 200 meters in 21.2 seconds. I probably couldn't do that now. I'd be closer to 40 seconds, I imagine. So as we grow older, our abilities decline, especially when you're this age. And I'm 71 years old. I doubt if I can run a 21.2. Aspects of life may continue to expand the vocabulary, while others slowly decline over time, like your reaction time. As you get older, your reaction time goes down. Your vocabulary may increase, but your vocabulary may increase, but your reaction time probably slows down quite a bit. And it's one of the reasons why older drivers are kind of dangerous. My son used to live in Florida, and he's driving down the road, and all of a sudden this guy just rammed into the back of him. And he looked back, and it was this old guy in a car, and my son was driving a smaller car, and the other guy was driving a Cadillac. And he couldn't figure out what was going on. This guy was right on his bumper. And so he sped up as much as he could, and the guy just hit the gas and slammed into him again. And he couldn't figure out what in the world is going on. By this time, they're hooked. And when he sped up, the guy, it pulled his bumper off. Uh, it had, the two bumpers had attached themselves to each other, and his car was a little bit flimsier than the Cadillac, so he pulled his bumper off, and he sped on ahead, and the guy caught him. Luckily, he was in the other lane. He was in an inside lane, and then he ran off the road. So my son stopped and said, "What the hell are you doing? You just ran into me 3 times, hit him 3 times, really hard." And the guy said, "I thought I was hitting the brake and I was hitting the gas." So yeah, eventually he got a lawyer that almost exonerated him for that. And he he was hitting the wrong pedal. He thought he was hitting the brake and he was hitting the gas. Anyway, my son got a new car out of it, but it was paid for by the guy's insurance and certainly not by him. And the guy didn't lose his license, as interesting as that is. Anyway, humans have the ability to change over time. We have what we refer to as plasticity. We can adapt to different circumstances. This is what a lady looks like if she smokes all of her life. As you can see, her skin dries out, gets more wrinkles, and she ages a lot faster because she's smoking. Our fates as humans are not cast in stone, of course. So we have the ability to optimize our time or truncate our time. We do things because we think we're supposed to. We do things because we think they're fun. We overeat. We eat a lot of sugars. We may shoot up with heroin. We may smoke dope. We may smoke marijuana. We may smoke tobacco. We may drink alcohol. All of these things potentially can truncate your life. And of course, if you exercise and try to eat a healthy life, try to eat healthy, then potentially you can live for an extended length of time, depending on your genes, of course. But sometimes we do dumb things like, things that were cool when we were teenagers. And of course, that will truncate things. That will slow things down. That means that you're going to die young. I had a friend when I was in the service. He smoked and I didn't. We both played soccer. He was a good soccer player, but he wouldn't move. He was kind of lazy. I don't know why he was so lazy, but he liked to do things like stand in the middle of the field and somebody passing the ball, and then he wouldn't try to dribble around anybody. He would pass the ball way up, and of course I ran pretty fast, so I was able to catch up with the ball. So this was his way of playing the game, was standing in the middle of the field and distributing the ball, and everybody else had to run. Um, I had a heart attack in 2010, and I had 93% occlusion of one of my arteries. Had to do with lifting weights, didn't have anything to do with cholesterol or whatever. But I had 93% occlusion. Recovered from the heart attack. Last time the doctor gave me an exam, he said, this is kind of amazing, but you had a heart attack 10 years ago and you don't have any damage to your heart. There's no damage. There's no scarring. I can't see anything. I can't see any damage from your heart attack. Well, oddly, in 2017, my friend who smoked and drank and didn't really take care of himself very well, he had the same heart attack that I did, and exactly the same place. Same artery was blocked, but his occlusion was only 87%. Mine was 93%. His was 87%. He died from the heart attack because of his lifestyle. His lifestyle was not as positive as mine was. I recovered 100%. He died. Which just goes to show you, sometimes you do stupid things like smoke, and sometimes you don't. And so you survive your heart attack and they die. That's just the way it works. People shoot up with heroin and they overdose and then they die. That's just the way it works. Sometimes you can optimize your life and sometimes you truncate it. Historical context, we all live in a time, and each era and time is marked by the history of that time. While your parents lived post Vietnam and 25-cent gallons of gas, you were living through 9/11, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And for 2 or 3 years ago, gas was was $4 a gallon. I can remember when I was in the service that gas was 25 cents. It was actually less than 25 cents. This is what soldiers look like. This is actually during World War II, I think. I couldn't find a picture from Vietnam. But they wore the same helmets, they wore the same uniforms and stuff. This is my brother in Afghanistan again. Here he is with his squad. 2005. This is him right here. He's on the end. He's the only one with a sidearm. Everybody else is just has a what do they call them? M4 rifle. Anyway, they were. I don't know why they stopped, but as you can see, Afghanistan doesn't have a lot of green in it. Historical context. So my war was Vietnam. Um, this is the way soldiers kind of look like in Vietnam. This is what they look like in Afghanistan and Iraq. The vehicles were different. The guns were different. Everything was pretty much different. And it was a historical context. We were fighting the communists, Afghanistan and Iraq. It's Muslim extremists that people are fighting, Taliban and Al Qaeda and ISIS. So, I mean, it's historical context. So your feelings, your ideas are all potentially different because of your historical context. Multiple causation, there are any number of things that allow us to turn out the way that we do. Biological forces, psychological forces, sociocultural forces, and life cycle forces. These two individuals grew up kind of the same. They were isolated in junior high school. They were both arrested. They were rejected by their peers. Uh, that's just the way it works. This kid was arrested in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and on December 13th of 1977. This kid was arrested in New York City in the 1950s. They talked funny. They acted different. This guy was a nerd, and this guy was from the South. As it turned out, this guy was once one of the richest men in the world, and this guy assassinated John F. Kennedy. This is Lee Harvey Oswald, and this is Bill Gates. I think this is when he got arrested. This is when he got arrested in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when he was trying to put Microsoft together. As you can see, he looks like a kid. They both looked young, but they grew up the same. The father was, in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, the father was absent. Bill Gates's father was a workaholic and was never home. They weren't really raised by their mothers because their mothers worked all the time. So they kind of raised themselves. So their trajectory was kind of the same, was pretty much the same. It was a different era. One grew up in the 60s and 70s. One grew up in the 50s and 60s. In the 50s, late 40s and early 50s. But other than that, they were both rejected children. They both had fathers that weren't around. And there were different aspects changed the trajectory of their lives. Developmental psychologists are interested in individual change over time. For this reason, it is important that they select research designs that will inform them about the change. And these, I can't remember, Kristen Stewart, maybe. This is the lady that married Elvis Presley. I can't remember. Priscilla Presley. That's who that is. And as you can see, this is what she looked like as a 17-year-old marrying Elvis. This is what she looked like a couple of years ago. This is Madonna. As you can see, this is what she looked like when she first became a star, and this is what she looks like now. This is Bruce Willis when he had hair, and this is when he graduated from high school, I think, and this is Bruce Willis today. George Bush, 2000. George Bush looked young. By the time his administration was over with, he looked he was a lot more wrinkled, a lot grayer, a lot more careworn. This is Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold Schwarzenegger was Mr. Olympia back when he was in his 20s. Eventually became governor of California. This is what he looks like today. Obviously, he's not lifting anymore. Not like that, anyway. And he's not lifting at all. He looks pretty flabby. Okay. Now we're going to talk about research. Systematic observation involves observing people or other animals and recording everything of interest that they do. There are two different types of observation. Naturalistic observation is the observation of people or other creatures as they spontaneously behave in their real life situation, naturalistic observation. Or you can do structured observation. That's where the observation of people or other creatures in an artificial setting to elicit a behavior. Let me give you an example. We already saw this picture. This is systematic observation. It was done in a laboratory. And of course, after seeing this lady pummel the Bozo the Clown, this little girl decided she'd do exactly the same thing. This is Joan Goodall working with chimpanzees in the wild. This is naturalistic observation, and this is systematic observation. Experimental observation. Experimental studies, an experiment is a systematic way of observing behavior where variables are manipulated so that an experimental variable can be observed. The manipulated variables are called independent variables, and the measured variable is referred to as the dependent variable. Another method of accumulating data is to have people answer questions or record their thoughts. This can be done with surveys or with diaries. This is from a experiment they did about 15 years ago. They had women fill out diaries as to these were women that went to clubs a lot. So they wanted to know how much alcohol they drank and what happened to them when they were at the club. And so it wasn't just these women, of course. But one of the things that they discovered was that the more alcohol the women drank, the more likely that they would be assaulted or abused. It seemed that it made men angry when the women were inebriated, as odd as that may seem. So men would try to take advantage of them, or they would attack them, physically attack them, hit them, or try to sexually assault them. As weird as that's not that weird. Some men have the idea that when a woman is drunk, they're fair game. Anyway, it was a really fascinating piece of research, and it was the first time we realized that society has different rules for different situations. Physiological measures or measurements of physiological activity using various forms of instrumentation, such as an EEG. An EEG is an electroencephalogram. It measures the electrical output of the brain. PET scans are positron emission tomography scan. That's this one right here. It shows what happens with a PET scan is that they inject radioactive glucose. Glucose, of course, feeds all the cells in your body. So when an area of the brain is activated and it's utilizing the radioactive glucose, then you can see which parts of the brain are more active than others. And that's what the PET scan is. Functional MRI is kind of the same situation. Functional magnetic resonance imaging. This is a functional MRI picture. It is a strong magnet that reads activity, and that's what we see in that picture. Once a researcher selects the method of testing, they must show that it is reliable and valid to be used on this population. Reliability refers to the test's ability to measure at the same level on a consistent basis. Does it always measure the same thing? Are we really getting what we say we're getting? And validity refers to the measurement actually measuring what they are supposed to measure. So if I were measuring somebody's ability to fly an airplane and I gave them a paper and pencil test, trying to find out what their intellect was, I wouldn't really be measuring their ability to fly with the paper and pencil test because, well, I'm measuring their ability to read the questions and answer the questions. I'm not really measuring their ability to fly. Research is generally done on a large number of participants to increase the acceptance of the results as generalizable to a larger population. The population is the total number of people who qualify for the research. The sample is the number of people who are actually in the research from the population. An example of a population would be if you wanted to do research on the Navajo Nation, that would be your population. The 1,700 or 173,000 people on the reservation. And the sample would be the people that you actually did the research on. You could probably not get 173,000 people to do your research, so you'd have to select a smaller group. And potentially it could be all the students at Dene College. And that would be your sample, the students at Dene College, and they would represent the population, all the people on the Navajo Nation. Correlational study. In a correlational study, a researcher investigates the relationship between variables. The results of a correlational study are normally measured by calculating a correlational coefficient or plotting the relationship along an axis that runs from +1 to -1. Okay, when I was doing my research for my dissertation, I was measuring resilience in American Indians. Two of my variables were age and resilience, and I was trying to show that there was a correlation between age and resilience. The older you were, the more resilient you were. So I gave them a test that measured their resilience, and of course I asked them how old they were, and then I plotted it along a line and to determine if there was a correlation between resilience and age. And what I discovered was that there was no correlation between the two. People were either resilient or not resilient, and it didn't have anything to do with age. Age was not a factor, as interesting as that is. So my result was close to 0 because there was no correlation between the two. Okay. One of the other things that I measured was resilience, of course. I still measured the resilience, and I also measured their level of cultural knowledge. And so I wanted to see if there was a correlation between their level of cultural acceptance and their resilience. And so when I gave them a test that measured their cultural acceptance, and I gave them a test that measured their resilience, and when I plotted it out, what I discovered was that there was a positive correlation between resilience and their level of cultural acceptance. So the stronger your culture, the more resilient you are. And this was, I did this study up in the Northern Plains with a group of American Indians. And what I was able to say was that there was a correlation between their culture and their ability to be resilient. In other words, the more you accept your culture, the more resilient that you are. And I thought this was a really important, important conclusion. Longitudinal studies involve observing and or testing the same individuals or groups at various times over their lifetimes. So a longitudinal study, you would take everybody in the first grade class, and you would test them for something, test them for their knowledge of drugs in the first grade. And then as they get older, you would keep testing them. Every year you would test the same group of individuals until they were 12th graders. Now you've got 12 years of data. You've tested the same people over 12 years, and that would be in a longitudinal study. Now, one of the interesting, really fascinating longitudinal studies is the Kauai longitudinal study by Werner and Smith. These two researchers began following at-risk babies born in Kauai in 1955. The research continues to this day, and I've got several books on it. Every 10 or 15 years, they'll write a new book about their longitudinal study. And what they wanted to determine was they were looking for resilience, and they wanted to know who was resilient. Now, these were at-risk children. So there were children born into a poor family. Maybe this a single parent family, and this was in 1955. And they've been following these kids ever since. And what they discovered was, as sad as this is, was that the individuals that were the most successful were the ones that left the island. The ones that joined the military, the ones that went someplace else to do something else. But the ones that stayed on Kauai, of course, Kauai was a farming island where they grew pineapples primarily. So the ones that stayed on the island, of course, some of them became supervisors. Most of them were just workers, and what happened to them wasn't all that positive. A lot of them became alcoholics and whatnot. Anyway, the ones that left were the ones that were the most successful, or the ones that were the most resilient. The ones that left and came back were the happiest, as interesting as that is. The ones that left and never came back weren't nearly as happy as the ones that left, made their mark in the world, and then came back. They were the ones that were the happiest. But longitudinal studies such as Werner and Smith do have their problems. Because the individual takes the same test over time, the practice effect comes into play. It is terribly expensive, and the researcher must be supported in their research by somebody. Usually it's an institution. And that's what happened with Werner and Smith. Now, the interesting thing, well, it's not, I guess it's not that interesting for you, but I was using a trauma scale that Werner developed to use with her longitudinal study. And I used her trauma scale, and I had to communicate with her in order to get approval to use her trauma scale. And I did. I used her trauma scale, as fun as that is. Cross-sectional studies are also measure people at different times of life, but instead of following the same people over time in a cross-sectional study, people of different ages are measured at the same time. Cross-sectional studies tend to be affected by differences between age groups. This is referred to as the cohort effect, as people raised at the same time, same era, are likely to have similar ideas. So people who are 71 like me, we are a cohort, and if I gave everybody the same survey, 18-year-olds and 71-year-olds, we would get a cross-section of society at this moment. But of course, it wouldn't show how we would change over time. It would just show how we were different at this one time. And that is the end of the slideshow. Sorry that I took so long, but that is the end of the lecture. Next week, we will talk about